This conference will now be recorded.
Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome back to this week's episode of the Digital Law Podcast, brought to you by Digital Law and produced by Anson Evaluate. As a bit of background, we're a law firm that works solely on technology, cybersecurity, and legal issues. In each episode, we look at stories in the law related to digital technology from around the world, with an emphasis on data protection and cybersecurity. I'm Amelia Davies, an apprentice solicitor at Digital Law UK, and I'm joined by my colleague Peter Wright. We're just going to be running through some news stories that have been coming up this week. So I will pass over to Peter to introduce himself, and then we'll get started.
Thanks, Amelia. My name is Peter. I'm a solicitor and the managing director at Digital Law, and we've got a lot of stories to cover this week, surprisingly, including more hacking from foreign states in the UK and a few quite messy issues around regulatory compliance when it comes to regulators themselves. So I will pass back to Amelia to take us into them.
Thanks, Peter. So looking at our first hack of the week. So Russian hackers have crashed the royal family website just days after King Charles' condemned invasion of Ukraine. So a pro-Putin group claimed responsibility for the cyber attack, which brought down the site for 90 minutes. So I mean, comparative to some of the other cyber attacks this year, this is not kind of one of the biggest ones, but we can clearly see here that, we're targeting what's going to hit the most and sending a message realistically here.
Yeah, it's profile, isn't it? King Charles had sort of issued that message with regards to standing with Ukraine, yet he actually met President Zelensky earlier this year when Zelensky came to London.
There we are.
He welcomed him to Buckingham Palace. So, arguably I'd have thought that was more worthy of then a takedown of the royal family website, but no, they decided to do it this time. So there's no accounting for when Russian hackers decide to strike. In this instance, it's not as though we're looking at a piece of particularly critical national infrastructure. And I think, the website tells you when the palace is open, gives you the court circular, what is the king doing today, what is Princess Anne doing today, what is Prince Andrew not doing. All these sorts of things are listed in fairly tedious detail. And but I think it's the fact that they can do it and seemingly do it at will is still the concern there, really.
Thanks, Peter. And I mean, that segues us very nicely into our next story, which is, would you guess, another Russian hack. However, this does have a little bit more of a lasting impact. So this is looking at Edinburgh's tram network, and it's among dozens of transport networks to be hit by cyber attacks. And essentially, the attack made the company's website inaccessible to its user base. And so I found this quite interesting myself, as I quite regularly visit Edinburgh. And for the last couple of years, there have been massive tram works. They've been setting up a completely new tram line from Edinburgh to Leith, I believe. And this was only completed in the last maybe month or so. So, a massive project. And now we've got this suddenly being hit by a cyber attack, making the website inaccessible. I mean, this is one of the kind of transport links and another example of critical infrastructure that is being targeted in these Russian attacks.
So this is interesting from the point of view, there is a government agency that works on protecting critical national infrastructure. So things like transport hubs, so the train network, the electricity, oil, gas, renewables, making sure that power stations aren't vulnerable to terrorist attack, trying to look after things like undersea cables, all this sort of stuff is critical national infrastructure that must be kept secure and indeed would then be relied on at different times depending on the security threat that the country is facing at any given moment. So therefore, when a new piece of kit like the tram network goes down there in Edinburgh, it begs the question, well, you think, well, surely this is a brand new piece of kit. How, this must be state of the art. How can that have been compromised seemingly so easily? But actually, it could be more vulnerable because it's so comparatively new. And the reason for that, and I must add here, this is entirely just hypothesis, but based on the fact that quite often what happens with big pieces of infrastructure is that the design is put together so long ago. So they'll have said, oh, well, we'll have this up-to-date IT, which will be responsible for the signaling and the engineering and sensors that will notify you of problems and blah, blah, blah. the stuff that you scope out in 2003 as being state of the art is not state of the art by the time it's actually in operation, and indeed could be potentially vulnerable. Until then, you have to pick it up and go, oh, well, what we've actually built here now needs to be updated and refitted with X different types of new IT, new systems, security measures, security wrappers, encryption, etc. And it wouldn't surprise me if perhaps in the slight rush to get this thing up and running, I'm sure it'll have been tested within an inch of its life, but you wouldn't necessarily have carried out things like thorough penetration testing on its systems, particularly of the sort of penetration that the Russians would be capable of carrying out. These hacking collectives have had a huge amount of success over the year, taking down different structures and organizations. So when we look at it in that way, you tend to think, well, it's probably not such a surprise then that unfortunately it's been compromised so easily.
No, and I certainly think, I mean, this is not the first of these Russian attacks in terms of critical infrastructure. And based on what we know, it's unlikely to be the last. So I'm sure we'll be back in, the future with additional Russian attacks.
We've been talking about Russian hacks, I think, on this podcast since episode 1. So no change there, unfortunately.
Thanks, Peter. So our next story is looking at the ICO. So a warning has come from the ICO reprimanding 7 organisations in the past 14 months for data breaches affecting victims of domestic abuse. So this includes 4 cases of organisations revealing the safe addresses of victims to their alleged abuser, to the point in which one case, a family had to be immediately moved to emergency accommodation because of revealing identities of the women seeking information about those partners to their partners. Also, we've had disclosing the home address of 2 adopted children to their birth father, who is in prison on 3 counts of raping their mother. I mean, we're talking about really serious breaches here.
Yeah.
This is not only a breach of personal data, but a breach of sensitive personal data.
Yes.
Which, by definition, it does require an additional level of security, and quite clearly here, it has not been given.
And the way it's described almost sounds like, unfortunately, it's the soft, squishy thing behind the keyboard that made the mistake. So you'll just have a caseworker in either the court service or within a law enforcement agency or within a charity helping vulnerable people, or even in law firms here. It's saying, law firms acting for, sometimes you might have a law firm acting for the victim of domestic abuse, or it could be the court is appointed to handle the best interests of children who are involved. So you can have lots of different organisations here involved in handling this, including NHS trusts if they are, administering where someone's been injured or requires ongoing care and support, as well as care agencies, those providing shelters, those providing accommodation, security. You get the idea. But overall, you'd expect that the handling then of personal data in relation to the vulnerable people involved would be top drawer. And the whole point here is that clearly it isn't. These are recent things that have happened within the last 14 months. So it's not as though we can point to, standards were slipped during COVID or the unprecedented times, blah, 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 which is an excuse that I still hear being dragged up quite often when it comes to different organisations. But in this instance, they can't point to that. This is just, I think the worry with this is that it's almost like sort of endemic systematic failure, which is the reason why the ICO is saying this simply isn't good enough. Because what's the point in having the standards if we aren't going to apply them to the most vulnerable in society that these laws are intended to protect? People get quite hung up about data protection laws, and sometimes it gets in the way of the most basic of operations. Oh, we can't confirm who's registered for you for the dinner that you're going to in 2 weeks' time because of data protection. I mean, that's just bureaucracy getting in the way, and also a failure to apply the law correctly. But it is also then in something like this, it's like, well, this is where that personal data should be very carefully looked after, not just casually copying in the wrong recipient, as seems to be happening. And the fact it's happening on multiple occasions in multiple different agencies is clearly a concern, which is why the ICO is taking this action. And I can see the ICO having to take more action to effectively continue clamping down on it. I see this being the first thing. Okay, well, let's go public. Let's draw attention to this. But then you can imagine that if it continues, then the ICO will look at that toolkit of enforcement options. So he could end up sort of issuing reprimands all the way through to monetary penalty notices.
I think it's interesting here the fact that the ICO is saying that the root causes for the breaches vary, but there are common themes in terms of lack of staff training and failing to have robust procedures in place to handle personal information safely. So, okay, you've got, as you mentioned, Peter, you've got law firms, housing associations, NHS trusts and government departments, all of which, are very much key players when you're considering domestic violence, domestic abuse. And yet they don't have enough staff training and procedures in place. You would think that those organisations and many others, they would prioritise staff training. And actually staff training is a comparatively easy way to manage risk within an organisation. Because, we ourselves, we carry out some training alongside Anson Evaluate, and we look at giving the organisation tools to mitigate risks and training to mitigate risks. And sometimes it can be just as easy as saying, make sure that you have a staff policy where they have to change the passwords on a yearly basis. Or, that was just an example here, but it can be just as simple as implementing minor things that, in your day-to-day life, fairly easy to do, fairly cheap to do.
Yes. And I almost wonder with this, is an element of fatigue in that without fail, any organisation we ever speak to about training, oh, yes, we have lots of training, almost like, no, of course we do. But I think that's the problem, is that it's treated as just routine. Everyone sits through the same data protection course, which is more abstract and clearly is not actually having the effect of making individual employees stop and think about their rights and responsibilities and duties when it comes to looking after personal data, let alone special category data, let alone data when it relates to vulnerable individuals. So instead of them sort of thinking, oh, actually, this is a really dangerous and very sensitive scenario, I need to be extra specially careful, instead they seem to be blundering through totally unaware of the risk, which then makes you think, well, how good is the training you're getting? And so often now, we're relying on sort of automated systems to deliver some half-hour click-through assessment that has to be done online, and probably people will have to be forced to do it, and will then do it under sufferance and not really think about what they're doing and what they're being asked. It'll just be clicked through and done, and right, let's move on to the next tedious thing that you have to do during the day, without actually stopping and thinking about identifying risk, doing something about it, understanding why it's important. And that, I think, is becoming a bit of a systemic problem. And that's why we are always saying to organisations, it's not just, do you have training and tick a box that you have training? It's, does this apply, and make your staff think about what their responsibilities are, how it applies, and how can they do their job more quickly and efficiently using standards that are put in place and mechanisms, rather than this is going to be a barrier that's in your way and this stops you being efficient, and here's the sit through the course, answer the meaningless questions and move on to something else. And that's the key thing here. I think it's poor one-size-fits-all training, and that's leading to massive problems like this.
Thanks, Peter. So moving from one regulator to another, we are looking at the FCA. So the city regulator broke data protection rules by intercepting and diverting emails, a policy that was allegedly signed off by Andrew Bailey's office and used to keep track of people considered a nuisance. So the ICO's office, the UK data regulator, concluded that the Financial Conduct Authority had infringed their data protection obligations after a former member of staff at the regulator complained about the policy. I mean, that's a lot to unpack there. And I mean, quite a few different problems.
Yeah, so let's first of all, for the benefit of the context, Andrew Bailey is...
So Andrew Bailey is, he currently is now Bank of England governor. However, at the time he was the FCA chief executive.
And that means responsible for UK monetary policy.
Not a big job,
Yes.
just someone working on the side.
Indeed. And previously he was at the FCA, the Financial Conduct Regulator, Financial Conduct Authority. And even now he's walking around saying how important it is when it comes to compliance that data protection laws are properly adhered to. And yet in this instance, it seems that his office, and we emphasise the word allegedly here, so it is alleged that his office signed off on the practice of intercepting emails and communications potentially from whistleblowers. And that could be, someone in a bank saying this mechanism doesn't work, or someone saying this individual isn't doing their job, or these things aren't being investigated properly, and I'm therefore notifying the regulator. And it seems that that communication will be intercepted. It wouldn't necessarily go where it should go, and instead it was being forwarded on to the organisation or individuals that the whistleblower was complaining about in the first place.
That's just fabulous.
Isn't it? And this could be, I say, people within, say, a bank or a financial service institution. It could be consumers complaining about the products or services that they had sold to them. Either way, the fact that it seems that people who are making complaints seem to be treated as sort of a nuisance, getting in the way of the good functioning of the regulator, isn't a good look when you think, well, that's surely what the regulator is there for, to regulate.
Yeah.
And reach decisions on with regards to complaints and things that are brought to its attention. So no one comes out of this particularly well. But let's stand back and look at the context. So we had the chief executive of NatWest, one of the largest banks in the country, resigned a couple of months ago now after, listen to our previous episodes about the debanking issue that Nigel Farage highlighted, which led to the resignation of both the chief executive of NatWest and the chief executive of Coutts, the bank within NatWest. And on those occasions, it seemed that they were failing to apply some fairly basic principles around data protection. Fast forward from that, we now have the regulator regulating those banks, and indeed the Bank of England, responsible for monetary policy, failing to understand and apply some fairly fundamental aspects of data protection law. And we could also point this then back at the point we were just making in the previous story around standards and data protection training. And it suggests that those at the top, probably haven't been along to any training on data for a very long time, probably very good at telling everyone else what to do and how to do it. And then, failing to actually appreciate the basics and apply them, which then doesn't fill people across an organisation with confidence when they think, well, hang on, I'm being told on pain of death what I should and shouldn't do, and yet the people at the top here seem to be putting in whole governance structures that ignore the basic fundamental precepts of UK and European data protection legislation.
And that's just it. We talk about training, but we're not just talking about training, the underlings, the people that just carry out this work on a day-to-day basis. We are talking about training everyone from the top down, and it's really vital that there is this no-blame culture and just an ethos of data protection throughout an organisation, because otherwise you have issues like this, because you may well find that, your Joe average person in the FCA, they are fully aware of their data protection obligations, as you said, through fear of death, but it's the people at the top that are making issues here.
The people at the top have to lead.
Exactly.
They should be, as an example, undergoing the training and then saying to everyone else, look, I've done this is what I learned from it, now you will need to do it. Not just sort of, as often seems to be the case, this is something for the little people to worry about. My mind is on higher things, so I won't go to the training that's been scheduled during lunchtime because I have an agreeable lunch to go to. It's that sort of attitude that seems pervasive in the leadership in many of these organisations, and that's what has to change.
Thanks, Peter. So moving on to our final story, and you've guessed it, we've not yet mentioned X or TikTok, so which one's it going to be? So this week we are with TikTok. So adverts for illegal bodybuilding drugs have been linked to fatal heart attacks have been viewed over 89 million times by young Britons on TikTok, a report has found. So the Centre for Countering Digital Hate found that users aged between 18 and 24 accounted for 76% of the 117 million views by Britons on content posted with hashtags promoting steroids and similar drugs on TikTok over the last couple of years. So, that's one of a lot of viewings, but also a really big problem in terms of the drug world, because, you hear of bodybuilders and you always say, I bet they're taking steroids, but obviously it's one thing to say, okay, well, they're taking them, but there are some really serious effects when it comes to taking steroids and performance-enhancing drugs. It's not just, you look big. It's, no, your heart can get bigger, which can then cause other additional problems down the line.
Yeah.
And you might be thinking, crikey, how does this relate to data protection? Well, Peter, why does this relate to data protection?
Well, I think this relates to a lot of the issues that we talked about in the last couple of podcasts, actually, when we were talking about apps like Temu, and we were talking about e-commerce, and we were talking about product standards and regulation. Now, these sorts of products, steroids, etc., are not supposed to be available for sale in the UK. You know, you can't walk into Boots and say, "Hello, can I have some steroids, please?" And I'll say, "Certainly, it's on this counter here." That's not how it works. So this stuff isn't readily available or, you know, taxed and regulated because it's dangerous to the consumer. And we know that because a number of sports people back in the 80s and 90s took steroids and then would have problems with stuff like heart failure and heart-related illnesses. So we kind of saw, I suppose back then you tend to think, well, you know, clearly this stuff, you can't use it in official competition, and furthermore, if you are thinking, oh, I'm training on my own account, you wouldn't want to take this stuff because it wouldn't actually do you any good. You know, famously, it was the sort of thing that a few people in the movie industry may or may not have been taking them to achieve the results that they had. But it was you know, people did not think that this was stuff the everyday person should take. These sorts of figures, though, when we're looking at hundreds of millions of views, and that's in the UK alone, we should add here, 89 million people, 89 million times these videos have been viewed in the UK alone. So I dread to think what the figures are for across Europe or across Asia or across North America or South America. I'm sure the figures are immense. And the point here is this stuff could then, you know, you might see the video, and this also fits into a broader issue on when it comes to social media, promoting unrealistic body types. Listeners might be followers of Strictly Come Dancing in the UK, and they have a contestant on there at the moment called Zara McDermott, who was in Love Island a few years ago. But she's an interesting person because she's made 3 different documentaries. One about revenge porn and how she was the victim of it twice and what it does to people. She also did a documentary about rape culture and the fact that particularly young men are being very, very aggressive in their dealings with women, and where does that come from? And she also did a one, I think it was largely about body image and issues on that around eating disorders. And the flip side of women seeing very unhealthy images of and thinking, oh, that's what I need to aspire to on things like TikTok, is you then see men and young boys thinking, oh, I need to have a six-pack, I need to have massive arms, I need to be able to do this, that, and the other. And the quick way of doing that is if you get these pills without realizing the very fundamental dangers of what it will do to you in the long term. So the fact that this stuff is sort of being shuffled through, the fact that even in these videos it then said, here are tips in terms of what you tell people when they ask what pills you're taking. You know, tell your parents that these are vitamin pills, for example. So specifically targeting young people who are going to be living at home, whose parents might say, what's that pill that you're knocking back? Then telling them, oh, say it's just vitamins or it's something else. Don't say it's actually, oh, it's a steroid, so I'll get massive arms. No. And this is therefore opening up a problem in that we've now got these products that shouldn't be for sale being marketed at people who are potentially very vulnerable to the messaging in those adverts, and even then being taught techniques to avoid scrutiny by people who might ask, well, why are you taking that and what are you doing taking that particular substance? So I think the thing to think about here is the sheer volume of these. I mean, we always know that when it comes to TikTok, we are always looking at very large figures in terms of total number of users, volumes of videos that are being seen, volumes of users engaging with them are simply off the chart.
I mean, not to mention as well, if we're considering TikTok here, you know, in terms of how the algorithm works, the more you interact with content such as this,
yes,
the more often it is going to be coming up in your feed. And there is that level of, okay, I keep seeing this, and it does take root inside your head. You think, oh, crikey, you know, if you are seeing this sort of content on a regular basis, then you are going to start considering it more.
Exactly. So it becomes self-perpetuating. And indeed, you can imagine the messaging becoming, as you watch more, it will then find more and more extreme versions of that message. So you'll end up seeing people with, in theory, greater and greater results from having used this stuff. Stronger messaging around this is how you order it, this is how you get hold of it, this is how much you will need, this is how much you need to take each week, this is when you should take it. You can imagine all that sort of messaging becoming quite almost irresistible to a viewer who isn't hearing what the downsides are. This could give you the resting heart rate of an 85-year-old when you're 18. They're not going to hear that bit. What they are going to hear is this is the way to achieve the look of all the people that you're seeing on social media. And it's not a healthy way of doing it. In fact, it's a potentially fatal way of doing it. So this brings us back to the wonderful questioning around regulation of social media and how should that be done, online harms, freedom of speech, but also, as I say, this sort of intersection between that and product safety and product regulation, which is something that we've had for centuries, to make sure the products that you buy don't hurt you or kill you. But the fact that in this way, this stuff can be sent in from overseas, circumventing all of the regulations that you would have otherwise have if you walked into a shop and asked for this stuff.
So that was our last discussion for this episode. But if you'd like to hear more from us, including subscribing to our newsletter, as well as receiving information about subscriber-only podcasts, webinars, and events, then please subscribe to our premium via Patreon channel using the link in the show notes. A big thank you to Anson Evaluate for helping to produce this podcast. And if you'd like to produce your own podcast or webinar, or you'd be interested to hear more about Anson Evaluate services, please look at their website that you can find at www.ansonevaluate.com. Just a reminder that these episodes are available on our website, our YouTube channel, podcast channels as well, such as Spotify, Apple Music, Amazon, and Google Podcasts. And please feel free to leave us a review. And finally, if you have any questions about what we've talked about today, please email us at admin@digitallawuk.com. Thank you for listening, and we hope to see you again next week.